Oh, doing it, and I just.
Yeah, and it's always, that's everybody is, you know, and then so it's it's like everything's a little bit, let's show them how to start reading. So that's, yeah, that's why I have my flash.
All right, well, let's do this thing. Hello, greetings and salutations, everybody. A few housekeeping things. On the schedule, for next Sunday is the class, the Synod. And I didn't necessarily plan super well because I want us to enjoy going to the Reformation Fair. And so I will, as I sent out this morning, the agenda this morning and the handouts this morning, it included a link where you could log in and go through the course on your own. I want y'all to do that for just next week's lesson alone. Now, when it comes to next Sunday, we've kind of got a couple of things. At the end of worship, we're going to have a short congregation gathering. And a gathering is not the same as a meeting. A gathering doesn't involve taking any action. And at the gathering, I'm going to be handing out some financial information about the church and talking about our stewardship program. And I imagine it will be 10 to 15 minutes long. And then when that ends, we will just transition over to the Reformation Fair. But I do want you all to make plans to attend the Reformation Fair. And Pastor John goes through a lot of work in setting it up. The deacons, the Men of Hope, do a lot in prepping for the meal that goes along with it. It is a true Christian education opportunity, and this will be our third year to offer it. So it's good every time, and I think John rotates new stuff in when he rotates stuff out. So some of the standing items that will be there will be costumes, the working Gutenberg press, some of the resources, but he changes out some of the artifacts, some of the books, and a variety of the games. So so do make plans to attend that. We are continuing to make our way through it. The third, we will talk about the true after party. And then that is the week before Election Day. And then on the 10th, we'll have a summation class, and that'll be the Sunday after Election Day. And we'll kind of pivot towards how we sustain ourselves and engaging relationships with folks who are exhausted, cynic, who's the other one, combatant, and how we sustain relationships and how we embrace those relationships, even in a Christian environment such as here at the church. So I want us to pin that. In case you don't know, which you should know, tomorrow is the beginning in the state of Texas for early voting. Not saying who or what to vote for, just that I consider it a responsibility for us to engage our society. John Calvin considered it a high responsibility for people to engage and participate in the communities in which they lived in, and publicly to do so. And John Calvin would absolutely be a promoter for everyone to fulfill your duties in voting, especially for those who are unable to vote. Take advantage of the freedom and the privilege of being able to do so. Again, that's not saying to whom or for what, just to do. Cool. Cool. Would someone lead us in our opening prayer?
I will.
Thank you, Mercy. The rest of you can think about who wants to lead the closing.
Okay, let us pray. Oh God, you have bound us in a common life. Help us comfort one another without hatred and work together with respect. Remove arrogance and hatred. Break down the walls that divide us and unite us in love. Spread your spirit so all people may live under the banner of the Prince of Peace. Heal our divisions, take away prejudice, and unite us in truth, peace, and love. Bless our land with justice and peace. Guide our leaders with wisdom and protect our liberties. Help us fight oppression and maintain justice, all for your glory. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So a reminder of our covenant thoughts: to listen deeply, to show curiosity, that we learn together and encourage one another. And as we work on encouraging each other, our question today is for you to say your name and who's the first person you think of when you hear the word encouragement. Go ahead and write that down on the paper now. So then when it's your turn, you can name it. Who's the first person you think of when you hear the word encouragement? Right. We are going to start with the folks on the Zoom. So we'll do Gloria, Marcelo, then Carolyn, and then we'll come into the room over to the Sharon. I know more. To Karen, and then we'll work our way around. So Gloria, say your name and who's the first person you think of when you hear the word encouragement?
I'm Gloria, and Ernie, my husband.
Okay, good. Hello.
Marcelo and my mom.
Carolyn?
Is it my turn?
There you go. I hear you now.
Okay. Caroline Scaling, and I'm gonna say my mom.
Hey.
Karen, my husband Bob.
Oh.
You stole it. My entire adult life carrying on.
Oh. I thought you were going to say, you said stole it. I thought you were going to say yourself.
Himself, yeah.
Diana and my husband Tony.
Carla and my dad.
Marty, my sister Lindsay.
Mercy, my brother Joe.
Oh, okay. My son's at 2, so they're looking for you to be Patrick and Brandon.
Nancy, my mother.
Well, I will join the crowd and everybody and say my wife, Wendy. I think when you have the opportunity to have those kinds of relationships, those are the ones who would do that for you. I did something a little different today. Instead of reformatting the handout and putting it into Microsoft Word, I just included the handout. And so that next page there at the bottom, you'll see it says page 33. We will follow through this, and but now I'm going to start with the video.
In this after party so far, we've been talking about the importance of making this big shift from the what to the how, and how this big shift involves prioritizing spiritual values, 2 spiritual values in particular, humility and hope. And last session, we talked about how this creates a profile that you can sort of locate yourself on your discipleship path. And we talked about the combatant. So the combatant, to refresh, is somebody who is actually low in humility but high in hope. Right? The combatant thinks they're right, the other side's wrong. This session, we're going to talk about the profile of the exhausted. And the exhausted is really the mirror image of the combatant. So The exhausted actually is high in humility because the exhausted isn't sure they have all the answers and they're willing to actually possibly entertain other answers. But the exhausted is low in hope. They're ready to give up if they haven't given up already. That's the exhausted. David, why is this profile, the profile of the exhausted, so important in politics right now?
Well, it's really important in politics for one very simple reason, which is that's the majority of Americans. So the majority of Americans right now are in what's called the exhausted majority. Almost 70% of Americans fit broadly within the category of an exhausted majority. These are people who, they long for compromise. They come from the right, they come from the left, they come from the middle, but they long for dialogue and they despair at the same time. They feel like their voices don't count, or they're drowned out by the loudest, angriest people. Maybe they venture a thought or an idea on social media and they're quickly gang tackled by their super angry uncle, their extremely angry niece, you name it. They're tired at the very mention of politics. We need the voices of those people who actually long for compromise.
Russell, talk about a particular profile of the exhausted in the church. I'm thinking about pastors, because you speak to a lot of pastors. What's going on for them?
Well, pastoral work is exhausting anyway. You're having to be with people on their deathbed, on their wedding day, and in their spiritual crisis. So you're giving so much of yourself anyway to the whole of a person. And then you add to it this expectation that the pastor ought to be an avatar of my politics, which often for a lot of pastors, the expectation is not just that my pastor agrees with me on all my political ideas, but that my pastor articulates all of my political ideas as though they were revealed truth. And what you have are often pastors who, if they're not careful, they start to become depleted by this. Some of them leave.
Don't demand that your pastor or anyone else around you agree with you on everything. You need to recognize your own frailty and fallenness, and guess what? 5 years from now, some of the things you might feel the most strident about right now, you might look back on and say, oh, oops, that wasn't quite right.
We need pastors to step forward in some ways and not in others. Pastors shouldn't feel as though I need to be an expert on every possible issue. But what a pastor does need is to say, in addition to thinking through what are the spiritual needs of my congregation, what do they need to know, a lot of times pastors are also thinking through what kind of blowback am I going to be dealing with? And so sometimes that can create a risk aversion where the pastor doesn't really want to speak to anything that's going to make someone angry. And so having a pastor who's able to, from the message of the Word of God, remind us of the fact that life is more than just whatever we're debating right now. And also to have a sense of, I cannot be your mascot for whatever your particular issue is, and still effectively lead you spiritually. And frankly, that's what you need. Right. And so a lot of the people who just want a pastor who's a cable talking head, they actually don't want that when they're sick. Yeah, that's right. Or when their marriage falls apart.
So if you're a lay member of the exhausted majority, or you are a pastor who is exhausted, we need you. The church needs you, God needs you, and let's together step forward.
With every place on this quadrant, I think we could make a mistake by thinking, I am one of these, and I have been, and I always will be, in some sort of a horoscope way. That's not the case. It describes a place where one is, and maybe a tendency that one has, where you tend to go. For me, I think the exhausted phase was something that came at a particular time in life. After a great deal of frenetic activity. And I think, as with so many other things, when you can't see the immediate fruit of your efforts. There's a way of exhausting the soul and exhausting the heart. I think exhaustion comes about the same way it does in the physical world. You do something, you press at something, and all your energy is expended. Politics exhausts so many people right now because it demands too much. When politics is demanding one's entire identity and place of belonging, then there is a kind of vigilance that comes with watching that all of the time, that it just isn't sustainable. All of us are a lot more complicated than whatever our political views are. And once we start to see ourselves only in those terms, or preeminently in those terms, we lose something of our humanity. And ultimately, the energy that's directed toward that strips away the ability to respond as human beings. And that's what the church often seems like. And that's especially true after we've come through the past several years with the Trump era, the COVID era, any number of things. We're in news cycles that don't ever seem to end. I used to say, oh, I dread election years because election years make Christians go crazy. We're in a time right now where we're always in an election year because it's not just that there's 24 hours a day cable news, there's 24 hours a day social media prompts. You just can't sustain a consistent level of engagement through all of that. And that's especially true when we have the sorts of conflicts that become personal. So it's not just you and I disagree on this, it's you and I are of different countries, or within the church, different religions. So that leads to a sense of exhaustion as well. You just don't have the energy to continue to engage because you don't see that time of quiet in between. It just doesn't happen right now. Well, the partisan mind is tiring because the partisan mind, for one thing, can't deal with the complexity of human nature, my human nature or yours, because the partisan mind is surprised to see goodness and image of God on the other side, whatever that is. One of the reasons that we're in this situation is that we're not enlivened by biblical doctrine or biblical discipleship. We're instead really enlivened by whatever proves me to be right and you to be wrong. And in this secularized sort of environment, including secularized within the church, those are usually whatever's the primary point of controversy in the world around me. And what's usually the primary point of controversy are political or culture war issues. That's why I almost never see a church that is on the verge of splitting over the Trinity. I almost never see a church that's on the verge of splitting anymore over what's the right way to worship, even though we saw so much of that, say, 15, 20 years ago. Instead, what we see are churches that are on the verge of splitting over the very same things that are being screamed about all around us. One of the things I recognize now often, I have pastors who give me almost the exact same story of preaching on something and just sort of parenthetically saying, turn the other cheek. For instance, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. To have people angry and coming up afterward and challenging the weakness and the refusal to fight on those things. And what was really disturbing to me is that inevitably when the pastor would say, well, I'm literally quoting Jesus Christ, the person would say, well, yeah, but that worked at one time, but it won't work now. Now we have to fight. As though there's some time period where there's an escape hatch from the Sermon on the Mount. And in many cases, what you had happening were people who would say, well, we're okay with the doctrinal teaching that we can find in Paul. It's Jesus we have a problem with. So we don't have a problem with the atonement. We have a problem with the person who is on the cross. That is a dangerous place to be. I realized at one point that social media particularly was exhausting me because I found myself losing the ability to maintain attention. I always needed to know what's going on. So if I was on a plane that didn't have Wi-Fi, I noticed that I would start to feel like, oh wait, I don't know what's going on. And I really found myself noticing this when I went to, there's a monastery in Kentucky that I go to often to sort of get away from everything. And I was there in the quiet, praying, and I noticed that I kept checking Twitter. And I said, I can't do this. I'm here to get away from everything and pray. And I put my phone away and I noticed that I was agitated. And when I really explored it, I realized what I really was feeling like is I'm vulnerable because I don't know what's going on. And it was at this sort of primal level, a sense of almost feeling like walking into a dark house and not knowing if there's something there ready to jump out at you. And that's a really unhealthy way to see things. Social media exhausts a person by giving these hits of dopamine. Every time you send something out there and somebody responds to it or hits its target, that ultimately strips down your abilities. Like anything else, you need more and more of it in order to get the same result. Social media also exhausts because people can get a skewed view of what people think of them by looking at social media. It's a sense in which I ultimately said, I need to stop looking at Twitter replies because it messes with my mind. It can give you this sense of siege mentality. Everybody hates me. And that can happen for anybody. For some people, it's because they don't get response the way that they want it on social media. They think nobody cares about me, which isn't true, but it can feel like it. Someone said, I realized everybody that I meet in person says I'm the greatest person ever, and everybody on Twitter says I'm horrible. And neither of those things are true. Neither of those things could be true, but it's the nature of how it works. That can lead you to a place where if you're sort of constantly on guard, looking around, you're going to become exhausted.
Let's take a moment here on the handout there. Help answer this question for yourself. What makes you feel exhausted? And check all that apply to you. Said check all that apply. And then that box below it, go ahead and take a few minutes and why do you keep exposing yourself to exhausting influences? So if you did not check all of the above, which ones did you check? For me, the only one that I did check was tense conversations. I've tried to curate my social media in a way that I don't engage or see a lot of noise. I don't really watch talk shows, and I do watch cable news and listen to cable news, especially news that is not aligned with me, mainly because I feel like it stimulates me and helps me to engage in my thought process, but these are not things that exhaust me. The one thing that I put under other influences that does exhaust me, which is why I don't watch cable TV ever, was like watching the football game last night live in real time. And the bombardment of advertisements from both of the presidential candidates, those were exhausting. Those were draining of me on both sides. Just, you know, gosh, how do I fast forward this in lifetime? So tense conversations and commercials during election season, those are the things that exhaust me. What about y'all? Yeah, Carolyn, unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, I clicked social media intense conversations. I'd say I clicked it mostly not because I follow those things, but because of my diverse amount of friends and what they post. So like I don't try to follow political things that are gonna test me, but I don't want to avoid my friends because when they post things that I want to see, you know, about the family, but if they start posting about political things, no matter if it's, I don't know, I don't want to just whether it's my beliefs or not my beliefs, it just starts and then sometimes conversations come from those.
Yeah, yeah. And with friends, you know, the other thing that you can't help not receiving is text messages. The stuff that might get texted to you, and you know, unlike social media where you can unfollow somebody, unless you block them on your phone, you can't really, you know, stop folks from forwarding you this stuff. I was at the Presbyterian meeting this week in Brownsville the last 2 days, and I was talking with a colleague of mine who said that she felt horrible because it's the first time in her career she ever had to block a church member on her phone. Even when she had asked for, you know, hey, please stop texting me these things. She had blocked him on the phone because it was too much, and is now redirecting him, rerouting him to engage with her in face to face, but you know, not the bombardment of text messages. So that's another source. Were there any other in under the other influences of exhaustion? Anybody put anything else down?
I had texts too.
Yeah, text messages, yes.
I put down online links to various articles. I wasn't quite sure where that filled up. I do read a lot of posts from a group, but it's a very liberal leaning group, so they usually will have links, oh, the shenanigans happening here, and they'll have a link, and it's only
Sure.
a link. But sometimes I'll read a lot of them, and this is happening here, and this is happening here, and this is happening here, so I'll stop.
Yeah,
But
so
that's how I get news as to what's going on, but it can be exhausting, really, all of this crazy stuff going
yeah,
on.
if you look at a lot of the online articles, even as you're reading the article, within the paragraphs, they may have hyperlinks to other sources or other articles, and you can just get into, fall down the rabbit hole
Yeah.
that way.
I put something.
Please.
Is exhausting for me is, it's tense conversations, but it's also
a conversation with somebody you love that you are not able to fully engage in so it's the avoidance, talking about social issues or cultural or certainly politics, but it is very exhausting to me to have a conversation with somebody that you love and have to not be able to, and that's one of the reasons I took this class, to not be able to talk about certain things. It's exhausting.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's the exhaustion is avoiding relationships or avoiding conversations is exhausting as well.
I had to do, I mean, this started for me back during COVID, because I used to watch homos. Press conference was the only information I was getting, and I had a friend call me, and she's very drunky, and she just went off on me because I was watching homos. She said to me, "You need to go where your people are. You need to go to New York, California." And as a result of that, I just don't engage with her. If she calls, I call, but she doesn't live here anymore. And I just thought that was really interesting. I need to go where my people are. I just didn't engage with her. There's no sense arguing with somebody. You can't get to first base with that. But
So condemnation is exhausting, right? So this idea of condemnation, condemning you, you need to go where your people are, is exhausting. Why do you keep exposing yourself to exhausting influences? What did y'all say for that?
Sometimes you can't help it.
yeah,
Work, if they're through work, people you need to communicate with at work, or through whatever you do and your family, they're kind of. Don't want to totally ignore your family, but to have those conversations.
Okay, so work and family are some reasons why we keep exposing ourselves to exhausting influences. What else?
If you keep scaling back on the things that exhaust you, pretty soon you've narrowed your life.
Yeah.
You put yourself in your own little silo that you're only gonna hear things that you like, and that's not productive at all.
Yeah.
I mean, you need to be able to hear the other person's point of view, but when the other person's point of view has an effect on your mental health over months and months and months, you have to come back.
Yeah. I put, excuse me, to keep up and understand contemporary events. And I had written down to remain relevant. And I think if, you're talking about scaling back, and as I think about, well, why, Josh, did you write down to remain relevant? What would be the, what's the fear of being irrelevant? And I think it goes back to the idea of misjudged or being condemned or labeled or, this, that, and the other. And I think that is part of the sickness, which is you keep coming back to these sources that are exhausting.
Yeah.
and for fear of, so that you might be ready in case the conversation comes up, and then it's just it's like putting an Aggie in a round room and telling them to sit in a corner, right? You just keep going in this circle, and thinking, well, I gotta be ready because I don't want to be judged or isolated or condemned, and so I got to keep up so that I'm not left out. But by not being left out and striving to keep up, I'm also harming and hurting myself as well. Anybody online want to say anything? Want to add anything? Cool. Let's go to the next side here. What do we seek or avoid when we expose ourselves to these influences? Let's talk about possible things that we are seeking: recognition, reassurance, or stimulus. Recognition because people are responding to what we post. Reassurance because we need to be right in our views, or stimulus because we don't want to be left with our own boredom, silence, emptiness. What might be some of those things that we might be seeking when we expose ourselves to those influences? Recognition, reassurance, or stimulus? Which do you feel that you connect with more?
really,
None of them really, I don't.
Stimulus.
I don't know.
Stimulus, yeah,
Because I don't want to be left behind.
you don't want to be left out, yeah, yeah. Good.
Community reassurance.
Reassurance,
Yep.
because we don't want, because we want to be right, we need to be right in our views. Okay. Yeah, I think this idea is that there's, you know, especially when you're thinking about social media, and when he was talking about the dopamine hit, when we look at fight or flight or freeze, it's the deer in the headlights. Like the brain's giving you that hit of adrenaline, the dopamine, the adrenaline to help you navigate the fight, the flight, or freeze, which then also triggers cortisol. And the cortisol is that which is helping you to sustain and you know, and that elevated amount is what is there and is sustaining while you are in a sense of danger. You know, caveman goes down to the lake and engages an alligator, and the caveman says, well, do I fight it? And then the chemicals needed in fighting it, you know, especially the cortisol, is heightened and there. And then do I flee from it? Do I run away from it? Well, in running away from it, it is still my brain, it's the cortisol is helping tell my brain, hey, there is still a sense of danger. There is still a sense of danger until there's such time when your brain can help the cortisol come back down, realizing you're not in danger, or freeze, that it is that hit of the adrenaline and the fear and the cortisol spikes so hard that you become paralyzed. And I think that there are microdosings of those that happen with our social media when we come across such an article, or when we hear a commercial, or when we're engaging any of those influences. But the long-term buildup of that cortisol has physical impacts leading to diabetes, overweight, mental health denigration, etc. And it is addictive. It is one of these things that your body can't burn it off quick enough. I was in a presentation recently about firefighters and police officers, about first responders, and it takes around 18 to 24 hours to burn off the cortisol after a shift. And yet they're back on the shift within 18 to 24 hours, 5 days a week or 4 days a week. And it builds up, which leads to the high burnout and other mental health issues like a high relationship dissatisfaction, divorce rate, suicidal ideations, etc., because these things just keep building up. And yet we can't fully take away from all of those influences, because in some maybe even unconscious way, we are seeking recognition. You know, every time someone clicks a like on a political post we made, right, it gives us aha, somebody agrees with me, aha, let's find out who that person was, aha, I know Marcelo agreed with me, aha, right? Or reassurance. I posted something and somebody put in the comments, yeah, brother, I agree with you. Okay, right? I'm not as Looney Tunes as I thought I was. Or simply because I'm looking at it and I'm looking at the feed and I see, okay, I see Bob has this comment that he posted, and okay, that reassures me that, you know, I like Bob, I agree with Bob, and that reassures me that I'm not as big a weirdo, and I'm not alone, right? I'm not alone with these thoughts. There's someone else who agrees with me, and that helps me feel better. What are some possible things that we might be, we keep going to those influences, exposing ourselves to influences, possible reasons for avoidance, in-person conversation because they require effort, boredom, silence, inner emptiness because these feelings are uncomfortable, anxiety, because we think that if we find out more information, we can escape uncertainty. And I think these are all what we're talking about, what we may be avoiding in-person conversations, boredom, silence, inner emptiness, anxiety. These are all manifestations of not being able to have peace in our lives, shalom in our lives, divorced from all of these other addictive, divisive concerns. Does that make sense? You know, not being able to have a healthy life of mindfulness and peace apart from all of these divisive issues or these negative influences, not being able to have the discipline or the skills or worldview apart from that keeps us coming back for these things that might give us some concern: boredom, silence, anxiety, in-person conversations. Any questions or thoughts on that?
I see the in-person conversations, it depends on who that's with, because I'm in a small group of friends. We meet every week and we've been friends for over 20 years and we don't talk politics. And that gives all of us peace, because I know I'm very liberal. One particular friend I know, because she's told me she is very conservative, but we are very good friends. We just don't talk about it, and I'm sure most of the others are also conservative. But that doesn't give anxiety or stress. It's like, it's very peaceful, and that's just something that's not discussed.
Yeah, I think part of what that requires, the effort, that because they require effort, the effort of having those good relationships requires developing good boundaries. And also, we may not know what boundaries we need to be able to articulate them. And because we may not know what boundaries we need, that would require effort of us to implement and maintain. We just avoid altogether. We just pull away and just not going to engage altogether. Or if I feel like I'm the kind of person who, you know, even with good boundaries, I still need to be right, and so I'm going to break the boundaries, right? That also is something I know about myself, so I may avoid in-person conversations because I won't be able to keep my mouth shut, right? And we spend all this effort in avoiding. Yeah, let's go to this next video.
Well, the exhausted are the ones who are being drained of hope. And Russell has described something of what that feels like. Now, most of the exhausted majority haven't gotten exhausted because they've been engaged in national or even local politics and have lost. The reason why most in the exhausted majority are getting exhausted is not by what they're doing, but rather by what they're hearing. It's by the stories that they're consuming about politics. We perhaps have tasted a little bit of that bitterness, a little bit of that fight and exhaustion, really in our relationships with family and friends. And we know how exhausting that feels and how it does make us feel like we're losing hope. Sometimes that experience happens in face-to-face relationships with family and friends, and sometimes that happens on social media. Social media especially exhausts us. It exhausts us because social media is built on categorizing us into various us versus thems. That's how social media works. It groups us into us and thems, and then it will tee up content that makes us afraid of the them. That's how it gets clicks. Fear and anxiety are incredibly powerful motivators, and so social media knows that and tees up the latest story of how awful them is and what the latest thing that them is doing to get us. As we bathe ourselves in these kinds of us versus them stories through social media, we get exhausted. We lose hope. You see, when we consume stories on social media, we're not actually in relationship. We're not actually in relationship with the people those stories are about. It's a false, faux relationship. The only stories that are actually real stories are stories of real relationships with people in our lives. So the Jesus practices for his how of politics involve stopping some things and starting some things. Jesus invites us to generate our own stories, stories of relationship especially with those who may differ from us politically. How can we actually conduct relationships that actually build hope in all of us? Here's a story that showcases how this happens.
I'm Nancy French, and I am married to someone you've already heard from in this course, David French. I'm a best-selling author and an investigative journalist. Being married to David is sometimes difficult when I see the way that the public perceives him, especially in social media.
I'm Kathy Kattenberg. I think I joined Twitter around 2007. I'm a political addict. I started reading National Review. David French was an editor and a writer on National Review at that time, had been for years, and I started reading David and disagreeing with him vehemently on everything. David and I disagree on abortion. That's one issue that David and I will never agree on. I'm sure of it, we will never agree on that. Well, being me, I start telling him exactly what I think. I would tweet it. Do you want women to die? Women have a right to control their own bodies. The woman is more important than the fetus. All things like that.
He's criticized sometimes for legitimate reasons, for disagreements on issues, but most of the time it is personal and it is awful.
I would get angry, and then I would respond even more angrily the next time.
In 2016, I wrote an article in the Washington Post that detailed my story of sexual abuse. I was abused by someone who was my vacation Bible school teacher. So I wrote an article. I wanted to publish it anonymously, but they don't do that at the Washington Post. And so I thought about it, decided to go ahead and publish under my name. I'd never talked about it before. The article went super viral. I got all kinds of social media response. I got emails from probably hundreds of people who told me stories of their own sexual abuse. Additionally, a lot of people criticized me. They were terribly uncharitable, and it hurt my feelings a great deal because a lot of those people were from my quote-unquote tribe. And so I decided in that moment that if anyone showed me kindness on social media, I was just going to follow them. Previously, I only followed people that I sort of ideologically aligned with, but at this point, I was like, forget it, I'm going to go with kindness. And so I started following a bunch of people. One of the people that showed me kindness was named Kathy Kattenberg.
I always knew there was a person named Nancy French, and she was married to David French. I had looked at her profile, but I didn't know anything about her. Nancy shared a very personal and very painful story of her own. She herself had had tragedy in her life, and I was just filled with compassion for her. So I wrote to her and I said something along the lines of, I don't agree with your husband on things, but I have so much respect for you and for your courage. I think it's enormously brave of you to have written an article for the Washington Post so everybody knows what happened to you.
I clicked follow, and every time I logged into Twitter, I saw her post, and she was not a huge fan of David. I just sort of scrolled past it and scrolled past it and scrolled past it. For about 4 months, every time I checked Twitter, I would see Kathy insulting David. So COVID hits, and I see a message from Kathy posted publicly, and she said, I will never eat again. I am stuck in this apartment. I cannot get groceries because of the COVID overload on the grocery delivery system. And she said, I just can't get any food. I don't think I'll ever get food. I didn't know it at the time, but Kathy was disabled and she couldn't leave her house. So Kathy posts that she's food insecure, and she was so against David. She disliked him so much. However, I sent her a direct message and I said, "Hi, I'm Nancy French. I'm David French's wife. I saw your post. What can I do to help?"
She contacted me on Twitter, on direct message, and she offered to help.
My phone rings and it's Kathy, and she has this beautiful New York accent, and I sound like I fell off a turnip truck, and we laughed at that. And she was asking me, like, "Why did you reach out?" And I said, "This is a treacherous time. What can we do to help?"
It was just astonishing to hear her voice on the phone. And we worked on finding a grocery that would deliver the food.
And that whole process was pretty funny because I had to talk to Kathy on the phone, and it was stuff like she wanted diced tomatoes, she wanted bananas, beef, just basic stuff. But when you talk to somebody about their food needs, it's very intimate. I placed the orders, nothing happened. The next day I called her back. "Hey, Kathy, I'm still working on it." We talked every day. At one point I was like, "Kathy, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I cannot get you food." And I said, "The only thing I think we can do at this moment is to pray." And she said, "Okay, go ahead and pray." Well, I do not pray randomly with strangers over the phone, let alone praying with someone who I sort of considered hated us so much. So Kathy Kattenberg and I together on the phone prayed that God would send her food. And it was very awkward, and we laughed.
I can't believe that any human being would do something like that, so personally kind as that.
We talked about a lot of topics. The most hot button topic was abortion. We're very pro-life. She's had multiple abortions. And so she told me that story. And when we had that conversation, it was so moving to me because her story was devastating. And so instead of telling her that I disagreed with abortion, I just said, "I'm very sorry for the circumstances that led up to that." And so I just showed her compassion. We worked and we worked, and finally Kathy calls me and she's just crying. She was like, "You're not gonna believe it. I have, 2 pounds of meat and 4 bananas. 30 minutes later, the phone rings again. My other orders had also come through. So now she had 6 pounds of meat. She had like 25 bananas. We had probably 30 cans of diced tomato. I mean, she was just like drowning in food.
For her to take a person that she didn't trust, because I was always attacking her husband, and to call me and arrange to get me food, it was huge. I mean, I couldn't believe it. And from that point on, we were friends.
I wanted to go meet Kathy in person because we had bonded. I got invited to perform at a storytelling event at Lincoln Center, which was a huge honor for me. And I thought maybe since it was close to where Kathy lived, she might want to go.
I went to see Nancy.
I was backstage. I had to give David Kathy's cell phone number. So when she arrived, David extends his arm and he escorts her into Lincoln Center. I knew somewhere that David and Kathy were sitting together listening to my story, and that cracked me up so much. It made the whole night just sort of more magical.
He was so kind. And it was the first time that I could really see graphically that a person can think very differently from me politically and be kind. And David is very, very kind. He doesn't have a mean bone in his body. Oh my God!
Hey there! It's so good to see you.
Oh my God!
How are you doing?
I'm fine.
It's so good to see you.
And so we've kept in touch for 2 years, and we've gotten closer and closer and closer.
Nancy is the best friend that I have ever had in my life. She's not just my best friend now. I have never had a friend like Nancy before in my life.
You've heard a story of a relationship, rather than being born on social media, actually taking place with each other in real life. Now take some time to reflect on this story. How did this story make you feel?
I'm gonna go ahead and play the last video. Let's see, Joshua, here we go.
Social media is absolutely not the best way to engage with another human being. You know, when I watched the story you just saw, what it tells me is that it is possible to bridge incredibly wide gaps between people when you interact with them as human beings, when you care for them as human beings. Look, I'm not naive. I know that you can reach out to somebody and they can rebuff it. I know that you can try to heal breaches and you can fail. These are things that happen in this fallen world. But I also know that if we treat people as social media caricatures, if we view them entirely through the prism of their political point of view and ascribe all of our judgments about them based on their political point of view, we're just doing it wrong. Everybody has a story. I'm reminded, was it Chesterton who said, "Be kind, everyone faces a hard battle"? We don't know the battle that other people face. And by giving them charity, by giving them grace, we actually have an opportunity to enter into their lives. Again, nothing is guaranteed. It's a risk to reach out to somebody. But if you don't break through that social media barrier, you don't even give yourself a chance to have the kind of relationship that Nancy and Kathy have developed. I know it is incredibly easy to make judgments about people based on social media. I'm somebody who spends time on social media as part of my job. As a columnist, I'm supposed to not just write my columns, but also talk about them, promote them on social media. So I'm there a lot, and I know what it's like to be seen entirely through that prism, as if I'm nothing other than the pieces that I write or the tweets that I send. And frankly, you know, it's in many ways only a very small part of me. One thing that I've learned is that sometimes the most aggressive people online are also some of the people who are in the most pain. People who are battling the worst demons, so to speak. And they're not necessarily political. It could be personal. And a lot of people, when they're vulnerable and they're hurting, they don't actually present as vulnerable. They present as very angry. They present as somebody who's lashing out, who's short-tempered. You know, when we know someone in their personal lives, we often are much more able to give them grace because we know their backstory. We know that they're going through something difficult. But often when we confront someone on social media, we don't even wonder if there's a backstory. We don't even think for a second whether they might be going through something difficult. I get a lot of backlash. People get very angry at me because of the positions that I take in politics. And I try very hard not to respond in kind because I don't know what that person is going through. I don't know their backstory. And if I use my platform, if I use my following to unleash on that individual, even if it's sort of perceived as self-defense, I could be inflicting real harm on them. And so I'm trying to be very careful about this. I'm mindful of the scripture that says, "A bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not snuff out." Speaking of Jesus, well, as a follower of Jesus, I don't want to be a person who's breaking the bruised reeds, who's snuffing out the smoldering wicks. So yeah, there are moments when I have to respond, maybe to clear up some falsehood, or I have to respond to clear up some mistake. But as a general matter, I try very hard not to lash back out when people lash at me, because I'm mindful of this reality. And this has been brought home to me many times over the past several years, especially as our political rhetoric has escalated. Often when I learn backstories, even backstories of people who've said vicious things about me, and my response to it changes from anger to sympathy and sometimes empathy, because I've learned that there is something else happening here. And that's why we can't accept people as sort of the two-dimensional caricature we see in a tweet or we see in a Facebook post. They're much more complicated than that. And by default, extending that kindness, extending that charity, you have a chance at achieving what Nancy and Kathy achieved by forming a real relationship.
All right, so let's unpack the last two videos here, and we'll take another 5 minutes and we'll wrap up today. But let's talk about that first video, the unlikely friendship. And one of the questions is in your handouts there is, how did that story make you feel? What did it stir within you? And what might God be saying to you in those stirrings? What are your thoughts there? How did it make you feel listening to that story?
Hopeful, yeah, it's very hopeful.
Hopeful, yeah, thought it was great. What else? What were some things that that Nancy demonstrated that or stated that were either ahas or demonstrated some of that hopefulness?
By reaching out, trying to get the food for her, she kept trying and trying, whether it was there or not, even though she begged out through this all the time.
Yeah.
She just kept on. She overlooked it.
Yeah.
Be persistent and trying to achieve a relationship or to help somebody.
Yeah, if you think about the 4 quadrants that we've talked about, that story demonstrated which of those 4 quadrants? The disciple, right? You had someone in Nancy who had high humility, that in all of the responses, the negative especially, that she had received, in that high humility, she chose, I will follow those who demonstrate compassion and kindness. And there is a high hope in accepting of that, even if these are people who may be outside my tribe. There is a high hope and a high humility in that decision to follow those who demonstrate kindness and compassion. And it requires, I think, a high humility to see, to see someone on that feed after having followed Kathy for months, to see her in a time of need and to say, I will choose now to reach out because there's something more important than the ways in which this person has caused attacks my husband or causes harm. And let's investigate this, let's explore this, and made that phone call. Kathy would have been potentially in which of those 4 quadrants? The combatant, right? Maybe a high hope but low humility. And tell what happened, Mark.
Well, what I was just gonna say before that was, Nancy didn't just see her as somebody who needed food in a pandemic situation, you really have to help, but taking into account her position on her husband's, the abortion position, she was persistent in learning that backstory because she said that Kathy had a history of multiple abortions, so obviously some trauma and tragedy there, and Nancy had experienced. So what I mean
Right.
is they really had something in common.
Right.
Experiences.
Or at least just the understanding pain, right?
Yeah.
So, and what did Nancy say? I may not agree with her on her views, but I can pray. I'm sorry for the circumstances that led to those decisions. And to the events, there was an event and there's a real human experience that took place that caused Kathy to be in those situations. And also through that dialogue came to learn that it wasn't that Kathy just, was sequestered to home, but was disabled and not able to truly be able to get out and take care for herself. Just a little bit more of information and an increase of humility led for Nancy to be able to understand something more about this person. What about this last video? It talked about everyone faces a hard battle, and wrapping all of the idea of the exhausted today, the idea of exhausted, wrapping it all up together. What would be takeaways or aha moments for us as we're going forth and engaging the world?
One of the things I like from what he said was, it's possible to bridge gaps between individuals by treating them like human beings.
Right, right. Yeah, I think the idea is that we end up, because we place people into boxes, right? We end up dehumanizing and forgetting that all are made in the image and likeness of God. Yeah, Patty?
I was just gonna say, being kind, you don't always know what someone's dealing with, so you have to reach out.
Yeah. Yeah, being kind. Yeah, Carolyn, please.
Listening to that story, it all makes me think of, like, at first Nancy and oh my gosh, I forgot her husband's name. It was seeming like it was coming more from a place of privilege, you know, like writing about their views, etc. and all. But then when Nancy wrote her article on her experience and all, it aligned her more with Kathy, and so then she was able to connect on a different level. I think sometimes we, in expressing our political views, that we might have our views but we don't think about how they might affect others in that human way, because we have never been in their position.
Well, right, and or even opened our heart open enough to hear. I mean, we may not have been in their position, but empathy and sympathy are rooted in just the opening up of our heart enough to allow to be penetrated for others to come in. Let's see, I want to draw something on the board. What would be adjectives of persons? Let's see, here we go. What would be adjectives of persons that you would consider to be your not like you, or the people that are exhausting? You know, what are adjectives that you would use to describe your opponent or people who do not think the way you do? How would you describe them?
Annoying.
Annoying, good. Annoying, good.
Aggressive.
Aggressive.
Intolerant.
Insensitive.
Would you say, Marcelo?
I said insensitive.
Insensitive.
Biased.
Intolerant.
Angry.
Angry.
Loud.
Biased.
Name callers.
Loud. Disgusting. This is an activity that I did with youth and youth ministry. You know, when we are coming up with all of these ways in which we are listing somebody, describing somebody, what we're doing is we're putting them in a box, right? But what we've really done is we've put them in a coffin.
Oh, wow.
Right? We have found ways to give death to their humanity, because in some ways we're all this as well. And I didn't ask for you to describe a particular political party or a particular political point of view, just to use adjectives of what your opponent may be. we all very likely have some strong positions on some certain issues that we all in here may not be in agreement or alignment on, right? The easiest thing I will say is in this very room 7 years ago, I led a conversation about changing our worship here at Hope. And you would have thought that the bats of hell would have come flooding out of from underneath us because, you know, the spawn of Satan was now preaching in the pulpit. And so just on the issue of worship, alone, the divisiveness of opinions, we began describing each other this way. And it culminated at one point during a gathering where there were two factions here in the congregation, and one person leading a position got incredibly angry and robust and stood up and exploded in verbosity in front of everybody else. And I think if you had asked both sides in the room that day to describe the behaviors and the characteristics and the thought opinions of the other person, these are all some of those that we would have come up with. But what we end up doing in this is begin burying God's people, the people we're called to serve and love. And you know, our job is to help do what? To proclaim the resurrection, right? To bring to life, to bring back to life those who have been wounded by humanity, those who have been put in the box. Our job is to participate in the liberation because Christ has liberated us from death into life. And these are things that I would be cautious about, or I am cautious about when I'm engaging on social media, when I'm engaging in conversations, and then I purposely go to put myself in positions with people that I know disagree, so that I can exercise that spiritual muscle of extending kindness, compassion, and learning how to humanize others, and to separate out the ways in which or compartmentalize the ways in which we disagree, so that I can have a meaningful relationship with the person that God has put in my life. And if it's just too abusive or too toxic, then I have to shut it down and have boundaries. And that's important to do as well. Does that make sense? So what I'd like for y'all to do is on that last page there, taking a step toward a disappeared loved one and homework, as I leave that for you to work on this week. And for those of you who joined late, I wanted to say that next week is the Reformation Fair that is happening during this hour. And you will do lesson 5 on your own. And the link for that is in the email that I send out. So the Cynic is a lesson that you will do on your own. We'll pick back up on November the 3rd. But I do want you all to, hi, Ramsey. No, she didn't have to hide. It's good to see you. I do want y'all to make plans to be at the Reformation Fair next week if your schedule allows. So we won't be in here operating counter to that. So any questions before we go? Good. If somebody would use that closing prayer and close us out, I would greatly appreciate it.
I'll do it.
Thank you, Nancy.
Let us pray. Most merciful God, we confess that we have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed, by what we have done and left undone. We have not fully loved you or our neighbors. Forgive us through Jesus Christ, that we may follow your will and glorify your name. Lord, we grieve the divisions among us and pray for healing, restored relationships, and the courage to pursue unity. Remind us we are invited to your eternal feast
and called to invite others near and far. Strengthen us through Christ to be lights of unity in a broken world. Amen.
Before we go, Diane, I know that you're here. I'm glad you're able to be with us, and want you to know that Diane is in the hospital for a week, and she's now in a rehabilitation clinic, and it's sweet and kind that you're able to join us, and we miss you, and I hope to come see you tomorrow. I'll send you a text. Bye, Ramsey.
She's riding.
Bye. Bye.